Alright, guys, what I want to do today is talk about the birth of the actual American Republic, the one that we know and live in today. One of the things we're going to see is with, the Articles of Confederation. That's technically the first government of, the United States. It's ratified 1781. But what we're going to see is really quickly, they realize it's just too weak, it's inefficient, it's not going to work. And so they decide, again, here's where we're going to get the Constitution. We actually need a viable, strong, central, federalized government, something that's far more capable than what we're going to see with the Articles of Confederation. Brought to you today by Aquafina, also known as OSU Tap Water. Whatever, I'm a cheap bastard. Anyways, so here we see, the United States as it's going to exist in 1783. And what you'll notice, you've got the original 13 colonies. But if you look, over here where Kentucky is or where Tennessee is going to be or things like this, a lot of those old colonies, Virginia especially, wanted to cling on to those land grants. You'll see here Connecticut, Massachusetts, because the original colonial charters said, they pretty much extended unto the sea. And so they had no idea how exactly vast the, North America was. So what we're going to see is, this period after the American Revolution, there's going to be some state infighting, some things going like that. If we'll look up here at Maine, which is technically part of Massachusetts, it's not going to become Maine until 1820. Part of it's going to be claimed by Britain. I mean, the nation still has some growing pains. And faced with that, it's these horrible Articles of Confederation. I do want to say I probably am not going to go in detail on every slide. This has some stuff I pulled from your text that will be good. But understand this lecture tends to be around an hour 20, hour 30 long. I have no desire to lecture that long. You have no desire to watch a video that long. So I'll probably cap it at around 50 minutes, give or take. But anyways, we're going to see that the Articles of Confederation, again, it's just too weak. The power is all vested with the states. The government can't tax. There's no standing army. And there's this idea that in creating a republic, they're going to harken back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. And so they're afraid of a standing army. I mean, let's go all the way back to Julius Caesar. He is a Roman general. How does he get power? He takes the army, crosses the Rubicon, marches on Rome, and boom, the Roman Republic is dead, replaced now by the Roman Empire. So there's this fear that a strong central government, a standing army, all of these things would be detrimental to the longevity of the United States. But the key problem is the federal government can't tax. Remember, and I think I made this analogy, if the federal government wants money, it has to go to Virginia and say, well, Virginia, you're big enough, we think you should give $3,000. But Virginia says, well, screw you guys, here's $50. The federal government has no, means to be able to get that money, out of Virginia. And again, I made this joke. It's about a year out of date, but hopefully at least somebody will laugh. There's no ice bucket challenge, of this day. I mean, there's no way Massachusetts can pay, $3,000 and challenge Virginia and so on and so on. Here, it's the government simply hopes that, yes, maybe you will do something. In addition, because that fear of a standing army, they want to rely predominantly on the state militia, even though, militias are chronically weak. They, realistically, despite what we want to think of the militia system as, being this idea that, everybody's armed with a gun, we're all going to turn out and defend the United States, blah, blah, blah. I say this even as a gun owner myself. The fact is, there's just no, militias are not well trained. The revolution was won by professionally drilled armies. George Washington will say that while militias have their place, to place all emphasis on the militia is surely to rest upon a broken staff. But this was seen as an expedient in order to preserve the government. That's what everyone is afraid of. And we're going to see, challenges with the government almost from the very beginning. Because when we see, first things like the land ordinances of 1784, 85, and then 87, this idea, how do you add new states in? Well, the Articles of Confederation, did not make any provision for that. Pardon me. I've been talking fine all day. Now I'm going to, hack up stuff. So what we're going to see is with 1784, this is the genesis of how states will be admitted to the Union. And it's going to say things like, well, states have to have Republican government, territorial governments will be controlled by the people, the federal government will only have so much power. But for a state to come in, all states must have state legislatures, they must have representative bodies. You can't have a dictatorial state join a republic, basically. Then in 1785, you're going to get things like, well, this is how towns are going to be surveyed. How are we going to get all this public land? Again, I'm going to jump back. And if you look here, this is the Northwest Territory here. That had not originally been envisioned by the 13 colonies. It hadn't fully been surveyed. Remember that proclamation line of 1763, even the British don't fully know what's out there. So what that means is they're starting everything from scratch. That's exactly what you want to hear in a lecture. Anyways, I could edit that out, but where's the fun? The big one, however, and it's going to show some of the growing pains, and this actually comes at the same time as we're going to get the Constitution. And this is the only real good thing the Articles of Confederation did, was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what this did, it said that 3 to 5 territories and then states would be created out of this region. And, it said, okay, here's how many people they have to have, here's what kind of governments, things like that. But more importantly, and we're not going to talk about so much in this unit building up to the first exam, but, remember this once we get to the next unit, because I know you're going to remember everything I say in this course. It said that slavery could not exist in the new territories. Already, what we're seeing is a clear division, north and south, free and slave. And that's going to happen, that's going to plague the Constitution. That's going to plague everything up until the outbreak of Civil War in 1860. The American Union, as it stands, is relatively frail. And it's so frail, in fact, that people, George Washington among them, I have no idea what that was, but apparently we're going all the way back. There we go. What happens is George Washington, James Madison, guys like that, they meet at Annapolis, Maryland. And what we're going to see is they want to try to find ways to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. They want some sort of strong federal central government. But understand, they don't have any legal means to do so. I mean, these are guys that had, been influential, they're politicians, they're well known, but they have no actual legal means to do this. And at any rate, they call for delegates, and only 5 states show up. So anything they would decide to do, it couldn't work. But what they do is they, this is not unlike someone like Donald Trump telling Barack Obama what to do, something like that. What they do, and yes, I just compared them to Donald Trump, bear with me. But what they do is they send a note to Congress, and they say that Congress should call an assembly the next year in Philadelphia and address the problem with the Articles of Confederation. Address the fact that they just don't work. They've been plodding along now for 3 years. Things aren't getting better. The states are still in debt. You've got all this problem. And they need to do something and do it quickly. Now, Congress is going to agree, but there's going to be an event that's actually going to play up and, put some teeth in this measure, if you will. Why this is important, why the Annapolis Convention is so important, and that's what this is called, is because it's going to show the rise of guys like James Madison, who, while he's president, will be president. More importantly, he drafts the Constitution. We start to see this desire, look, we're not immediately going to go back to the ways of Great Britain. The ideals of the American Revolution are fantastic, but we have to have a certain amount of force in the government to make the nation actually work. We can continue to be as afraid as we want of tyranny and despotism and things like that. But, what's the quote from Russell Crowe, Master and Commander? Men must be governed, not wisely, but governed all the same, or something to that effect. It's we don't want a tyrannical government. We don't want a strong central government, but one is, to an extent, necessary to have a diverse nation. And one thing to consider is we're now going to deal with the fact that the United States is not a singular noun. What I mean is, think about it. When we say, well, the United States, we say it as if it's one thing, that just one, when you picture the United States, you see, well, the United States. But at this day, 1786, United States is a plural noun. It doesn't mean necessarily one nation. It literally means these states united, a union of sovereign states. There's still some debate. Is Maryland sovereign? Is Virginia sovereign? Can they leave the union? Are they bound to what the federal government does? At some level, this is almost like a European Union type thing. And in fact, these questions are not going to be solved. Pardon me, I'll just yawn on the video. I'm as bored as you guys are, apparently. But they're not going to be solved until the American Civil War in the 1860s. Right now we're starting, but a lot of these questions, even the guys who are going to meet in Congress at the Constitutional Convention, they don't even know the answers just yet. But as I said, they don't have quorum at the Annapolis Convention. They're going to meet in Philadelphia the next year. But what puts, iron in the glove, insert analogy here, is this guy. A former Continental Army officer, Daniel Shays, who will lead the first rebellion against the United States government. We make it all of 3 years before there's a rebellion against the government. What had happened is in Massachusetts, understand again, there's a lot of debt. And we have the issue of inflation. Farmers are poor. Farmers can't pay their debts. We have the rise of what's called debtor's prison, which is the absolutely brilliant idea of you can't pay your debts, so we're going to throw you in jail, remove you from your job, and throw you in jail until you can pay your debts. Think about that one for a second. We're going to take you from your method of employment and imprison you until you can pay off that. Yeah. But it's what happens. And so what's going to happen is, there's all of these things going on. People aren't listening. People complain to the state legislature. But the legislature can't do anything. I mean, there's limits to those. They appeal to the federal government for help. There's nothing there. And so Shays gets a bunch of guys together, and he launches a rebellion. I mean, what he's going to do, he's going to march on Boston. He's going to free some of these debtors. He's going to try to obstruct trials. Stop, imprisonment for these debts. And what we're going to see, these aren't just, backcountry folk. These aren't just undesirables. These are Continental Army officers and many, Continental Army soldiers. There's that whole issue. If you can rebel for a cause you believe in, if the next government, and this again, it hits what Thomas Jefferson said, where, the blood of, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of patriots, or, things like that. This idea, blood of tyrants, this idea that if you can rebel for one thing, you can rebel again and again and again and again, so on and so on and so on. So what we're going to see is, they believe that because the governor is imprisoning people, because the governor isn't stopping this runaway inflation, this is also the day and age, if your money is worthless, the idea was to print more. Well, okay, $5 won't buy you anything. Here's $30. But if you keep spending you're printing all this money, it's all worthless. And so inflation happens, people still can't pay off their debts. And so the Shayites, as they're called, believe that, this is contrary to the revolution. This goes against what people had fought for. That, this needed to be changed. And so, again, they take up arms, they rebel. And the biggest issue is the federal government can't stop it. Why? Well, one, it can't do anything about the economy. It can't do anything about the debts. There's no strong executive. I mean, to do anything, numbers of states have to agree. And remember, there's no standing army. They cannot assemble an army of the United States and send it to Massachusetts. They have to call on various states. But, Virginia's not going to send troops to Massachusetts. What do they care? And so Massachusetts has to stop it on its own. Now, it's going to work. There's not that much bloodshed. I mean, there's not a lot of fighting going on. But there's a lot of societal tensions. A lot of problems remain. And the biggest issue that the federal government, because it could not stop this rebellion, because it could not even prevent this rebellion, is people realize going into this Constitutional Convention the next year in 1787, the Articles of Confederation are worthless. So now the idea of the convention shifts. Instead of being about simply revising the articles or making them tougher, Now the trend is going to be scrap them, start off anew, and build an entirely new American federal government. Again, some of the Shayshites, you'll see some guys dressed in their continental uniforms. This guy, a lot of guys just dressed as militia or whatever they'd be wearing. I mean, this was a popular thing, but it showed all the problems. It showed, how inept and weak the federal government had been. And so we're going to see that these reformers at what we'll call the Philadelphia Convention decided, if there's the issue of tyranny over here, and then so we're going to go this far and have, no centralized government. These people want to somehow, move back this way, and if not create a tyrannical government or a king, say, they want some sort of reform. Excuse me. They want. I should probably edit that out, but we'll do this as if it's live, unless the ceiling falls apart. Then we'll edit it. But what they're going to do is, they want to, they want a centralized government. They don't want to go too far to the right, too far to hard centralized control, but they do want to curb the excesses of democracy. Understand, their view is not that Massachusetts was in the wrong. Their view is not that debtor's prison was bad. Their view is none of that. Their view is that Shays shows that in a free democracy, if you don't like something, you pick up a gun, you try to change it. And for any modicum of stability, you have to address that. You have to, stabilize the government and ensure that people are not going to do that. Specifically, you need to both make sure that the rampant inflation, things like that, are not going to happen. But at the same time, ensure that, if there is a rebellion, the federal government can swiftly and efficiently move in and stop it. So understand, whereas the Articles, this idea of preserve liberty, prevent tyranny, the Constitution is going to be a much, much more reactionary document. We started off afraid of going hard right. It's mirror image, so I'll do it hard right, because again, right, totalitarian, tyranny, dictatorship, how we perceive George III. So we go all the way to the left. But the problem with going to the left is we've become inefficient. So now we're going to swing back to the right again, and we're going to have a lot of debates. How far right is too far right? How far right is not far enough? We don't know. Again, this has not been successfully done. And one of the things it's going to cause is this idea that the continental dollar, the money printed by the United States government, was so worthless it was called not worth a continental damn. And understand, the states have a huge war debt, both to the federal government, both to themselves and individual creditors, some to Britain, and they want it repudiated. They want the federal government to either say, no, you don't have to pay this money, or things, just forgive the debt, absolve it, whatever. The problem is that's bad for business. If I loan you money, okay, and then because you've got high debts, you have it absolved. Better idea. Something we can all relate to. Student loans. You get out of college with around $10,000. Let's say you're me. $10,000 in student loans. I should say it's $10,000 for my undergrad. I added another $60. So I'm not bitter. But $10,000. Okay. But you default on it. You want it forgiven or absolved, so you default on it. You don't pay, whatever. Well, then another lender later on could look at that and say, well, you can't pay your debts, so we're not going to loan you money. Now, if we put that on a national scale, okay, well, loaning money in this case means we're not going to trade with you because we don't think you can pay your debts. So those really, really rightist guys like Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, or rather will be Secretary of the Treasury, realizes that this is going to be bad for business. And so people try, what they do, states are going to enact poor laws. Things like debtor's prison, things like they'll make you get a job. There is no welfare at this time. The problem is that causes unrest, discontent. It doesn't, coerce these people to pay their debts. It's kind of like some things we see today. If you work 40 hours and you can't pay your debts, what are you supposed to do? Passing a law saying, well, if you don't pay your debts, you're going to prison. If you're working as much as you can and you can't pay your debts, what are you supposed to do? And so we see the rise of the absolutely brilliant banker. And by brilliant, I am being completely facetious, sarcastic. What they decide to do is print their own money. Again, this is how we get inflation. Well, if there's not enough money, if you don't have enough money, let's just print more. The problem is you'll get money like this, state-issued money. $20, South Carolina. What this means, you cannot take that to Massachusetts. Okay, well here we've got Massachusetts, $8. You can't take that to North Carolina. So you might think, well, I've got $28, if you were to have both of these certificates. Let's say you're an intrastate trader. But the fact is you have $20 in one state and $8 in another, and God help you if you want to go to Philadelphia. If you're in Pennsylvania, there's nothing you can do. You're broke. It's not like today where, and consider this, if you have cash, which I don't know what it is, both because, who uses cash these days, as well as, I'm married. And as the old joke says, if you have $10 and your wife has $15, then your wife has $25. But anyways, hopefully I didn't offend anybody, but I love my wife. I make jokes about her, so stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more coming. But she's not murdered me yet. We've been married 5 years. I'm still alive. So the way I look at it, best case, I don't die. Worst case, if I die, I don't have to pay my student loan. So it's win freaking win. Sweet. Anyways, where was I? So it's this idea that, you're printing all of this money. You're screwing up economies. And again, if you can't, today, now I remember where I was. Dr. Prince Comedy Hour, right? Anyways, if you have $30 today, you can spend that online. You can spend it here in Oklahoma. For those of you out of state, you can spend it wherever. It doesn't matter because it's backed by the United States. Now, is it backed by gold or silver? It used to be. Now it's backed by what's called the full faith and credit of the United States government. What that means is that money is actually worth the same as this piece of paper, but the United States government says your piece of paper that happens to be green and have a dead guy on it is worth more than my white piece of paper. Unfortunately, because I have a hell of a lot more of these. But in all seriousness, the problem now with, in this case, of all these states printing money, it doesn't create a unified nation. Again, North Carolina acts how it wants. Massachusetts, or if you look here, Massachusetts, they would always use F's instead of S's. It was really weird. But Massachusetts, they can do whatever they want. And so how can you have any semblance of a single United States? Remember, again, each state saw itself as sovereign. That's going to help to explain the Civil War. So what we're going to see is because this paper money is worthless, and I'm talking state-issued money in some cases, in many cases actually, what would happen is individual banks would print the money. So what would happen is, okay, you'd have money from, say, the Stillwater National Bank. Well, that's fantastic. But if the guy who buys, who sells the food you really, really want only accepts money from Bank First and will exchange it at, $1 of S&B for 50 cents Bank First, paper money is worthless. So we see people wanting what's called specie or hard money, coins, gold, silver, things like that, actual metallic stuff that retains its intrinsic value. That you can go and with $1 worth of gold in North Carolina, buy $1 worth of gold worth of stuff in Massachusetts. Now the problem is, I have no idea what's wrong with me today. The problem is, because this is universal, creditors start wanting it. Again, they realize that, okay, well, let's say I go to Freddy's Frozen Custard. And again, I have Stillwater National Bank currency. They only take Bank First. So they had taken on a 50 cent to, dollars. So, okay, I give them $20 to pay for my $10 worth of food. Well, one, that sucks to be me. But two, what are they going to do with that $10 money now? It makes no sense for them. So in many cases, they'll just refuse it. So they will now want this hard money. But the thing is, lower classes, it's hard for them to get this specie. Because what happens is as people print this money, what we'll see happen is $1, okay, now becomes worth 75 cents, but that $1 worth of gold keeps its intrinsic value. So what you see is almost two different currency systems of gold and silver being worth one thing, paper money worth something else. So again, we get that high inflation. And then so what happens it hurts trade. You get a lot of poor people. They're the ones who are really affected. So the merchants don't have money to spend, which means they don't have money to put in banks, money to pay taxes, which means the states don't have that much to tax, which, again, there's no income tax, which means the states don't have that much money to contribute to the federal government, which means the federal government doesn't have that much money to contribute to paying off those foreign debts. And remember, one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Paris, 1783, to get the British out of the Northwest Territories, we had to be able to pay our debts. So the entire system is rotten, the entire thing. And so because of that, with this Constitution, with this idea of rebuilding a new, stronger, centralized federal government, we see a correction, if you will, against the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that you are entitled to both. You're entitled to live, to not have a government unjustly treat you, and you're entitled to go find your own happiness. But with the Constitution, now that's life, liberty, and property. You're entitled to your life. You're entitled to not being, thrown in jail against your will. But you're also entitled to your property. You're not. The Constitution doesn't care about your desire to be happy. For any of you who think, in politics that, American government wants you to be happy, no. They say you should be alive, you shouldn't be persecuted, and you have the right to property, which also means you have the right to pursue debts owed to you. That's why we're going to see, two factions emerge. The Federalists, these are the guys that want that federal constitution. They, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, people who want a strong central government. But you're going to see the rise of the Anti-Federalists. Now, they're not a political party. They're just against the Constitution. But the Anti-Federalists, they think the Constitution is going to be too tyrannical. They're worried that, look, if we concentrate all of this power centrally, and again, they want to preserve against the excesses of democracy. They don't want you being like, well, I have the right to be happy, so screw you, federal government. I'm not paying my student loans. If only, right? They don't want you to do that. Instead, they want to make sure that, okay, you're going to be treated nice, you have the right to life, but you better pay your loans. The Anti-Federalists think that will be too tyrannical. And then we also get the issue of states' rights. Now, when we talk, you might hear modern Republican candidates talk about states' rights. Historically now, when we think states' rights, we think states' rights, Civil War, slavery. Because many people say, well, the South seceded for states' rights. Yes, states' rights to do what? Own slaves. Read the founding documents of South Carolina. Read the documents of secession. They say it themselves. That's not revisionism. That's what they say. But stepping back before that, there's the issue of states' rights in the sense, again, the belief was that we were 13, sovereign independent states mutually joined in a union for our sovereign benefit. We did not necessarily consider ourselves one union. So understand, there's all of these things at work and at play. And because of that, because, we are sovereign states, if we have to be in one government, how do we determine, who's going to rule? What I mean is, we have two plans based for representation. In the sense, with the Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote. But Virginia has a lot more people than New Jersey. So if it's done based on representation, and we say that, people have the right to choose. Oh, excuse me. Again, I have no idea what's wrong with me. Apparently I need to take some notos before doing this. But this, if the small states have the right to choose, sorry, I got ahead of myself. If people have the right to choose, then Virginia is going to have a lot more votes than New Jersey. So you have the big states say, well, we need to do it on representation. That way they control the government. But New Jersey wants equality in the small states. They say that Virginia should have no more say than, the smaller states. New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, things like that. Virginia wants a unicameral legislature, one house. They want basically a House of Representatives. Everything on population. But New Jersey, they want a Senate. They want that one vote. And so what we're going to get and this is key to the modern American governmental system, is that compromise. What we get is a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. We have the lower house based on representation, the House of Representatives. But the upper chamber, the Senate, where everybody, equal representation, everybody gets 2 votes. And the idea being, House sponsors a bill, then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate ultimately decides, things like that. Now, this isn't fully workable, necessarily at the moment, but they will put it in place. Understand, there's also, early on, this is where representation came from, voting by representation. When you vote for the president, okay, it's might be nice to be like, yeah, so-and-so is winning the popular vote. You're not voting for the president. You vote for the elector, who will then choose who to vote for the president. And we've made the system now where, okay, let's take 2012. If you want Barack Obama, you vote for this elector. If you want Mitt Romney, you vote for this elector. If you want somebody else, you vote for this elector. And it's the Electoral College. Again, another safeguard. Because what we're seeing is this fear of the excesses of democracy, what we'll call mob rule. So that's why we see the representative house is the lower house, why we see the Electoral College instead of simply letting the people vote for the president. Understand, these people were very dismissive. I mean, for all that we want to say the Founding Fathers were amazing, they're very dismissive of the lower classes. They're very dismissive to debtors. They're very dismissive to, a lot of people. Understand, when we talk about voting, we're not talking universal suffrage. We're not talking universal male suffrage. We're not even talking universal white male suffrage. You had to be a white male property owner to vote. More people can vote here than can vote in, say, Britain. But understand, not everyone is going to get to vote. But that dismissiveness rears its ugly head here with slavery. Slavery, again, that American paradox. It's with the Constitution from the very beginning. Now, the South wanted something of a power grab. They wanted to say, why can't we count our slaves for the purposes of representation? They're people. They're not equal people, but they're people. They do this because in many of the southern states, South Carolina, specifically, slaves outnumbered free whites. So it was this hope of capitalizing on that to give them more governmental influence. But the North, argues, well, and understand, by the way, I should say, the North is racist. I have here just as racist as the South. Let's maybe say 50 shades of racism here. And it's a horrible analogy, but I mean, there's racism. I mean, you're a racist, and is there really different? Not necessarily, but understand, racism exists in all aspects. And so the North says, well, if they're property, why should the South allow to count them? You'll have Northern senators and representatives at this convention. I should just say representatives. They'll say, well, if you can count slaves, and slaves are property, then we in the North want to count cows for representation. Now understand, the North, if they had truly been benevolent, and I say this because getting ahead of the Civil War, we have this image of the North, wanting freedom, wanting black equality, things like that. This could have been their chance. If they had said, yes, count them for representation, they could have cited that later on as saying, well, look, if we do that, then they must be people, and so here's the grounds for ending slavery. But understand, the North wanted political equality late in the 1860s, not for any desire of actual equality or ending racism. It was done for power. It was done to make sure that they had more votes. So what we're going to see coming out of this is what's called the 3/5 Compromise. And this is hugely important. What it says is that slaves in the South, for representation and taxation, will count as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, they can count 2. What this means is that even the North, to keep the South in line and to prevent, what we're going to call later the slave power conspiracy. We'll hold off on that till after Unit 2. What we're going to see is the North doesn't view slaves or even freedmen as necessarily people and surely not citizens. So understand, they're not citizens, but, the South gets what they want. They get representation. The North gets what they want. They get taxation. And so we're going to see whatever moral thing there's going to be. And remember, that land ordinance, you can't have slaves in the North. There's the bit of morality. But there's also going to be the whole issue that politics trumpet. It's power. The North doesn't want the South to run the government. The South doesn't want the North to run the government. And that sectional divide will, within, I'm going to do math, it's going to suck, 80 years, split the nation. So with slavery, a couple of things we're also going to do is, if we look in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, which is in your textbook, there's the issue of the slave trade. Despite the fact that there's a number of slaves already in the American colonies, what would happen? We're still bringing in and importing and trading and auctioning off slaves from Africa. Even, in the United States Capitol, across from, it's not the White House yet, but the president's mansion that they're going to build around, 1800 or so. What we're going to see is you can watch a slave auction. There's this whole issue. We're the nation of the free, supposedly, but over there is where you go and buy a slave. Now, understand, the Constitution never uses the word slave. But what it does, it crafts all of these protections and makes it constitutional. And part of why they don't, because we'll see things like 18A, timestamps, if you will. Part of why they don't is there's this belief that slavery is something of what we're going to call a necessary evil. You'll have guys like John C. Calhoun, who is absolutely crazy. We'll be talking about him a lot. But he's going to say in the early, I want to say 1810s, 1820s, that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. Why you would do that, I don't know. Crazy Southerners, but hey, whatever floats their boat. It's like holding a wolf by the ears. I guess, now I can see my, you don't want to do it, but you don't dare let go. And nobody asks, why do we get in this position in the first place? Why don't we just stop and move on? Whatever. This idea, they don't like slavery, but it's necessary. It's going to die off. Everybody can be happy. And people believed that for the longest time until the 1830s when Southerners started getting really, really xenophobic and really, really, really clinging on to that slavery, where even John C. Calhoun will go from saying it's, quote, a necessary evil to, quote, it's a positive good. But stay tuned. We're laying the groundwork. So with this government that's formed out, we're going to segue, and we'll probably skip through a fair amount of this. We're going to segue into kind of a government class. 3 branches: executive, the president, legislative, Congress, and judicial. We create a Supreme Court system. And the whole point is to have, various checks and balances. This idea, one branch isn't going to get too powerful. But understand, nothing is fully defined yet. Even though the Constitution says this stuff is there, they don't fully know what to do with it, how to define it, what it's going to do, what the limits are, things like that. For instance, the judicial branch. The Supreme Court, it's almost an oversight. It has no real power. It's vaguely defined. Nobody knows what it's going to do. In fact, nobody even knows if it can call a law, unconstitutional. That comes later. They don't even define such things as how do you address the president. You'll have guys like John Adams. Remember him. He's going to become vice president under this new government. But he's going to say things that should be like, His Highness, protector of American rights and defender of the same. Weird, long, stupid titles of nobility. Eventually, they're going to shorten it to just Mr. President, because this idea, don't go crazy with titles. If this is a Republican government, then, the idea is theoretically anybody can be president. It can come from any walk of life. And so titles, make them simplistic. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary, stuff like that. In fact, Adams, though, is so gung-ho on, trying to show just how awesome the office of president is, that, creating these elaborate titles, that because he was a big dude like me, and I'm patting my fat gut that you can't see, what we're going to see is some people in the Senate will start calling him His Rotundity. More or less, in 1780 speak, they're saying his fat ass. That's what they're going. Now, it's not an official title or anything like that, but they do it to show the absurdity. Just say, Mr. President. Just, be, do something fairly simplistic. So when we're going to get to the ratification, I'm going to start blowing through this because it's about 40 minutes, and I do want to, wrap this up in about 10 minutes. A lot of this, please read on the slides on your own or find in the textbook. But again, you have those two factions. The centralized Federalists on one hand, and the Anti-Federalists who wanted a decentralized government. They admitted the Articles weren't perfect, but they wanted to keep up, at some aspect, with the status quo. They wanted to ensure that the government was not going to be too tyrannical. Now, I do want to just have a note here really quick. The Federalists will morph into one of the first political parties in what we'll call the first party system. Please, on your exam, the second party in that system will be known as the Jeffersonians or the Jeffersonian Republicans. They are not the Anti-Federalists. Many Anti-Federalists go over, but what we'll see is there's no direct correlation between these these factions and the political parties that spring up. But the Federalists, guys like, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, what they're going to do is, again, push for a strong centralized government. They're going to write under pseudonyms, papers and various, newspapers trying to get people get on board with the Constitution. Understand, the Constitution was by no means a clear-cut thing. Anti-Federalists are going to be guys like Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. The guy, with the penknife. Or, my personal favorite, the Brewer Patriot, Sam Adams himself. And so what we see, there's not necessarily, the whole idea, it's what politics should be. This idea that both groups want the same thing. They want a successful, working, independent United States. But they see two different visions and they want to go about it differently. And understand, some can be friends. Again, John Adams is a Federalist, Sam Adams is an Anti-Federalist. But that also doesn't mean they're not going to get into a lot of fights, say a lot of nasty things. Understand, politics is just as nasty, then as it is today. So we're going to see if the Anti-Federalists, it's this idea that they're afraid of tyranny, they're afraid of a strong central government. Today we have term limits for the president. There were none. So there's this fear that whoever isn't president will just keep getting elected over and over and over and die in office. They're afraid, that Congress will start infringing liberties. Basically, they're afraid that this will try to duplicate the British system. The executive will become like a monarchy, Congress will become like Parliament, and they're going to have to rebel all over again. And so we can see, if we look, I'm not going to go into all of their debates, but if we can cut through enough of it, we'll see, again, it hinges on this idea. Is the United States a single nation or a confederation of sovereign states? Can Massachusetts exist on its own and do whatever the hell it wants? Or is it simply a part, a necessary subdivision of the United States as a whole? That is the ultimate question. There's also this issue, remember, we are not a democracy. We have democratic tendencies, but we are a republic, and the Federalists seized on that. That's what they wanted. Again, at this time, if you were to cast your vote, you're voting for an elector who chooses the president. You do get to vote for the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, but the Senate at this time would be chosen by the state legislatures. So the Senate has power. Your role, your individual role in the American system is incredibly limited because people are afraid of mob rule. What's supposedly the Ben Franklin quote, democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for dinner. Liberty is a lamb contesting the vote. They're afraid that if you have, just a lot of people and they want to do something, that they can impose their will on the masses. So a strong centralized federal government would protect those groups. But the Anti-Federalists were afraid that because the strong central government could curb, the will of the masses, that, if a lot of people want to do something, it's going to be overridden by the government. Consider this. Look at the gay marriage debate, which I'm just going to say this about it. I don't want to get too political, but I'll just say this. These people have been discriminated against for a long time. There's a movie out now about the Stonewall riots. But it's perfect for, this example in the sense, if a sizable population, okay, and it's these kinds of problems why both groups, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, have an argument. If most of the people want gay marriage, why shouldn't it be allowed? But then if a smaller subset don't want it, should they have the will of the majority forced on them? And so there's this whole thing of nobody fully knows. It's hard to work out. I mean, it's one thing it's a case by case thing. I mean, you can't paint all this really with a broad stroke. But understand, the Constitution creates a republic, not a democracy. This idea that your individual vote matters less than, the person who's representing you. You vote for the representative then represents you. And so if Congress wants, to pass a national law saying go gay marriage, then, that's it. All, whether or not you voted for the guy, he still represents you. That's the thing. And we're going to see, because of all these battles, and because, again, both groups want the same thing. The Federalists want the same as the Anti-Federalists, but they want to do it in a different mindset. We're going to see, there's going to be a lot of writings, there's going to be all this stuff, but the votes are always going to be close. The Federalists are far more popular. They're out there. Their names are often more well-known. They're seen as less fringy types, as well as you're going to have the Federalist Papers, which will be a collection of their writings, which to tell the necessity for this government. Again, it's those John Jay, Madison, Hamilton. Now, there are going to be Anti-Federalist papers, but they're not as widely circulated, they're not as well published, and they're not as well known. But understand, at these various conventions ratifying the Constitution, the votes are close. In New York, it's 3 votes. In Massachusetts, it's 19. In Virginia, it's 10. If these 3 had swung the other way, the Constitution would not have been ratified. Now understand, one reason why it is ratified, and one thing in our system, and I use the gay marriage, but I bring that up again, because we're trying to see, 2 different issues, 2 different viewpoints, but it's the same coin, in the sense you have to accommodate at some level the will of both. You cannot say, well, us over you, you over us. You have to deal with both groups. And so the Anti-Federalists push, and to swing their votes, they say, look, what if we had a Bill of Rights, amendments to the Constitution to grant individual liberty? And so James Madison will ask, he's the primary drafter, and he asked, and there's going to be lots of amendments. I want to say it's over like 30 or 40 potential amendments. And what they do is they whittle it down to 10, and they do this while the Constitution is submitted. The ink's not even dry on the Constitution. It will be ratified in 1789. But the committee gets 10 amendments, which they are going to go to Congress. And a lot of these, and I've chosen 5 particularly, you can see those direct lineages to the American Revolution. First Amendment, you have the freedom of speech, press, and assembly. You can say whatever you want and not be... And by the way, that's what freedom of speech means. It doesn't mean that you can, say an anti-gay remark or something and get away with it. I don't know why that's, my thing, probably because it's in the news. Again, I'm just thinking the Stonewall Riot movie. Okay, it doesn't mean you can say that or, and get away with it. It means you can say it and not be jailed. If you get fired, that's your own problem. But the First Amendment doesn't protect, okay, I am an employee of OSU. If I went on a tirade about, say, things like the Black Lives Matter movement or the assassination of a police officer, or I posted something on Twitter or Facebook, it's my right to say it in the sense, the FBI is not going to bang down my door, but it's, OSU has the right to fire me. And so understand, you have the right to say whatever you want, but exercise a little discretion. You have the right to freedom of press because, newspapers had been seized. You have the right to assembly because, remember, intolerable acts that had been suppressed. You have the right to bear arms. Now, here is my one real political thing. Well-regulated militia. That doesn't mean government regulated. If you look, well-regulated at the time meant in working order. Look at Ben Franklin's biography, which the Supreme Court has done. He talks about, people having a well-regulated constitution, meaning they're physically fit, they're capable. It doesn't mean that people should have a whole bunch of regulations from the government. I'm fine with gun control. That, to an, effective government gun control, that's fine. But understand, well-regulated does not mean that, they were saying in 1791, yes, the American government has the right to do all this. It simply meant well-regulated militia. The militia should have working arms and be able to function. Moving on to non-political things. Right to speedy trial. You can't just be held without cause. Again, things from the Revolution. Right to avoid self-incrimination. The Fifth Amendment. You can plead the Fifth. Now that means we all know you did it if you plead the Fifth, but you don't have to say, yeah, I killed the guy. You can plead the Fifth. And then as well, not having to quarter soldiers, in homes. Again, a tie back to the Quartering Act. But above all, the final amendment, the 10th Amendment, stated, and this is probably the most crucial, that all powers, not delegated, by the Constitution, not specifically said to the federal government, were reserved for the states. What this basically said, and this is gonna cause lots of debates. If one interpretation, strict construction, if the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, then you can't do it. But loose construction, if it doesn't say you can't do it, then you can do it. But further, this is that nudge to the states, saying the states still have power in the constitutional system. So what's the result? If we want to tie this all up together, it actually didn't take as long as I thought, but this will be the last slide for today. The Constitution will be ratified in 1789. Washington will be unanimously elected as the first president. There's this, that big shocker. Everybody knew it. And this creates the modern American government, which we're going to talk more about in our next lecture, probably on Wednesday. But what we're going to see, more important out of the constitutional debate, is what we're going to call the anti-federalist tradition. This idea that would serve many Americans in politics today. You go along with the will of the majority. You don't, they could have kept popping up amendments. They could have tried to derail the Constitution. They could have done whatever simply because they didn't like it. But instead, they said, if this is the will of the majority, we're going to go along with it. We'll try to change it later. That's fine. We'll change it from within the system. But if this is what most people want, that politics, while nasty, was functional then. Today, it's dysfunctional. Today, you don't have Republicans going along with the majority about Obamacare. It's, repeal and replace, but not really much on the replace. The anti-federalist tradition that, realistically, it's going to kind of die out, obviously, with the Civil War. But it's this idea of, well, we lost this time. We lost an election. We'll see you in 4 years. Or we don't like it, but we'll go along with the majority and we'll try to change it. They don't rebel. You don't see another Shays Rebellion. You don't see anything like that. But instead, what you're going to see, whoops, wrong way, is what they try to do is change the system from within. Have the Bill of Rights. Make other laws. Expand the powers of the various offices. Work within the framework that the majority wanted. So again, this is kind of more, Government 1103 or whatever they call the government classes. But this sets us up well for talking now about Washington's presidency and some of the trials. My hope is with this first unit, we're going to get through the War of 1812. You guys are an online class, so we can do that, but, we'll see. Check up on D2L. Make sure you're current on the homework. I posted a few announcements. And if you need anything, as always, feel free to email me. Thank you, and once again, I will see you in the next video, hopefully with fewer yawns. I'll take some notos first. Bye-bye.